I just wanted to thank you, Spirit, for taking the time to talk to me this afternoon. I know you're really, really busy, as always, even prior to the volcano erupting, earlier this month. There's been a lot going on. You've been a central figure in the cannabis ganja movement, not just in St. Vincent, but more broadly throughout the Caribbean. Um, and you've been a real force for change. And I've always looked up and respected what you've done because you didn't see it necessarily as the role of one person or an individual. You always saw it in terms of a movement, a social movement, and the need to organize people on the ground, which I think is unique compared to a lot of other places in the region that has tried to take this, very liberal, let's ask nicely, and work together. You were quite clear, and your history is really fascinating in terms of, 20 odd years ago, like what was happening in 1998 with the politics in St. Vincent, about how you've been organizing ganja farmers for many, many years. So I'm just thankful that I got the chance to meet you when I was in St. Vincent. And I was just saying earlier when we started the call, how generous you've always been with your time in terms of, opening up your community to me, and letting me see the lives of ganja farmers in St. Vincent, and also giving me the real history and politics that you have been living, right, and creating in terms of your work. So I just wanted to say much respect to you for everything that you've been doing, for not just very recently with the reforms and everything and getting the cooperatives going, but those years and years and years and decades of work that you've put in organizing people and being somebody that came out of the Black Power movement and never really strayed in terms of your principles and the way that you're rooted in the community and how you see that as the way to bring about change. So I just wanted to thank you for that, and for joining us this afternoon.
Kevin, you're welcome. And
Yeah.
I see you as a comrade. I see you as a friend. And I must let you know that anything that helps to deepen the process, the democratic process, the process relative to cannabis reform, you're welcome. And I'm ready to serve.
Okay, no, this is great. So I'm glad. So we're gonna have a discussion for maybe around 45 minutes. Um, but one of the things I wanted to just start with for people that are not familiar with you or St. Vincent, in terms of, if you could just tell us a little bit about your personal history and background and the connection to cannabis, uh, and how that sort of influenced what you're doing now.
I'll tell you something. First of all, I must say I have over 50 years experience in the struggle for cannabis reform. I remember very early in the 1970s, late 60s, 1970s, when I first got attracted to cannabis. It was a time when the Black Power movement was just emerging in the region, and I got involved in the movement. I was particularly influenced not just by the movement internationally, particularly in the United States, with Angela Davis, with Jonathan Jackson, but the movement right in the Caribbean. In Jamaica, you had people, I think it was WPA. In Trinidad and Tobago, you had NJAC, and you had the guerrilla movement there fighting for national independence and freedom. And all that influenced me as a young guy in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But of course, that influence could not have been effective without uh, uh, circumstances on the ground here of poverty, of unemployment, of marginalization of the poor black youth from the community. So that had an impact on me. And at first, I joined the movement. Oh, there was an organization called Organization for Black Cultural Awareness. We didn't stay long there. We broke away and we formed Black Liberation Action Committee, in which I was the leading founder. And we went on during the war for Black liberation. In those days, it was more Black oriented than anything else, but we later developed into a socialist oriented movement. In 1973, I was imprisoned for the assassination of the Attorney General of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. 3 of us were accused, were charged for the murder of the Attorney General. It was a time when we launched a guerrilla movement. In those days, we were very adventurous, but we launched that movement, and for 2 weeks I was on the run. There was lots of police from the region and nationally, and I ended up in prison. I was sentenced to hang. I later won the case in 1976 at the level of the Privy Council. I did most of my studies in prison in terms of my political consciousness, thanks to my imprisonment, in terms of my ideological clarity, thanks to my imprisonment. And I was able to use prison as a university. Some people usually say prison is a university, but it becomes a university when you apply yourself. So I did lots of studies in prison, and I think, had I not gone to prison, I wouldn't be the kind of person I am here today. I spent 11 and a half years in prison. I came out in 1984. I became a member. In fact, I was a member of the United People's Movement, the movement in St. Vincent that led the freedom struggle. Movement which consisted of people like Dr. Afghan Saabs, Renwick Rose, A. John Saunders, and others. I was a member of that movement until the movement became defunct subsequently, and it became defunct in a large way, you can say, influenced by the defeat of the Grenadian Revolution. I knew Maurice also.
Okay.
Maurice, he defended me in court in the same case as an act of solidarity, because our movement here and Maurice movement in Grenada and the other movements in the region, there was a sort of network. So it was not just a St. Vincent movement, it was a regional movement, and I was part of it. Today I'm here. I got involved in the cannabis movement. Even in those early days, I remember in the days of Black Liberation Action Committee, that cannabis was used as a means of even supporting the movement financially in those days. It was subsequently used. Cannabis was used in helping the liberation movement in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So it was not just seen as a recreational something. It acted as a means. It served as a means of finance to the liberation movement in these days. So sometimes I feel very disappointed when I hear some of the same persons who would have benefited from the contribution from cannabis either remain silent or somewhat opposed to what is going on in the cannabis world.
I think that's a really important way to look at it, because a lot of people would just see cannabis as a plant, right? Or you said as a recreational, they use it as a drug. I don't like to call it that. It's a plant, but there's a lot of symbolism within cannabis in terms of the history of Black people in the Caribbean, but also globally, about how it's been a symbol of oppression and white supremacy, about how you can have alcohol and rum and whiskey and everything like that. But you know, if you have a plant that grows naturally and it brings people some relief, it's going to be banned. But because it's also something that people can take control over, it's related to the land, it's related to determining your own path in terms of how you heal yourself, right? So you're someone that is fascinating, because when I came into this in terms of looking into the history of ganja, cannabis in St. Vincent and St. Lucia, where my family is from, and I've seen similar things, but it's not organized the way that it is in St. Vincent. It's not as politicized as the way it is in St. Vincent, and I think that's hurting them in a lot of ways. And I think the lessons that you have for people, you know, for the more people to hear about it, and that the reforms that we will talk about later in 2018 didn't just come around because of a group of politicians deciding it was time to move, but because of this longer history that you were just talking about people being politically active, but also conscious of how cannabis can play a role in their liberation. Because
Exactly so. Because we saw cannabis as the legalization of cannabis. We saw it as, and I still see it as, as part of the liberation movement, the freeing up cannabis, as we saw it as part of the movement for liberation, as a component of that movement. You know, so we didn't just say, you don't just look at cannabis from the perspective of smoking, or from the perspective of medicine, but we saw it as a liberation force.
yeah, I think that that's something that's still going on, and why I had a lot of and I do have a lot of respect for the kind of politics that you've brought to this kind of debate, that it's not just about the legalization and that's the end of it. You've always been very consistent in terms of talking about the need to use it as a vehicle to bring about meaningful change to the poorest people in St. Vincent in particular, but across the region, that if they're going to be left out, that, you know, this is not something that you would want to pursue. Because I remember when I was there and in your shop and we were talking, and one of the things that you said is that you want to be very careful about legalization, that you said in a perfect world we would legalize across the board, but we realize that we are a relatively small and poor country, and people can take advantage of us with foreign investment, and we need to make sure that we're in control as much as possible when it
Yes,
comes to
because when we look at legalization, we don't look at legalization. We have to be careful. We have to navigate the way forward very carefully. Otherwise, we can run the risk of legalizing and putting cannabis in the control, or have it being monopolized by few individuals. Like and I look at it from the perspective of the traditional cultivators. Right now, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we put forward a position of there's the medical cannabis industry. Some people ask us, there's those persons who call for full legalization. But we think that full legalization at this particular moment is just going to transfer the monopolization of the industry from a small group of drug dealers to a few privileged people who have the monies. Because if we're going to legalize nationally, one time, yes, I'm making a point, Kevin, is that from our experience here, notice that, for example, look at the the local market. What we know is that cannabis as a recreational something, you have to look for it for the highest THC. That's what recreational people go for. It must be high in THC. And saying so, it means that you have to have a particular strain, a particular type of cannabis where you have that kind of ingredient. But seeds are very expensive.
Yeah.
Who can afford the seeds to plant such cannabis? Not the growers, for sure. Not the ordinary person. The children of the well-off classes. The children of the money classes. So we are afraid that to move directly to legalization is going to take the industry from the hands of the traditional cultivators who now sell it illegally and put it in the hands of the establishment, which is more in sync with persons from the more well-off class. I don't know if you get my point there.
Yeah, no, you came across loud and clear in terms of how.
And then also, you have to, if you are running a cannabis industry legally, you have to set up something like coffee shops. You have to have license. You have to have something well established and at certain standard. It means again that the tourists come here, or whoever comes and gonna buy their cannabis, they're no longer going to be going into the community in the ghetto where it's been just sold informally. They're going to go, or they're going to be directed to the establishment which are legal, but who's going to control those?
Yeah.
Has to be people who have money. The traditional cultivators doesn't control those. So we support the move towards a medical cannabis. And with that allows, with the passage of time, we expect that when the traditional cultivators are better placed within that framework, then the issue of legalization can become more priority. I don't know if you understand that point.
No, it makes sense. It's to protect the farmers ultimately, that
Right.
you're trying to find a way, because if you open up too soon, they'll get displaced. So you have to find a balance, right? Because I think that's the thing that a lot of people that are talking about legalization, they're naive about power, right? And how that works. And
how it works.
Yeah.
So we want to ensure that when legalization comes, that the traditional cultivators are better placed within the framework. They're making money then.
Yeah.
They're eating food. They're being able to feed their families.
Because that's a real problem. Yeah. That we see that in Canada here, because we legalized, a few years back. But what we have, where everyone was thinking, oh, it's going to be great. Well, the main thing was that people smoking a spliff in the park or on their street corner would not be arrested, because there's that human factor, the human rights factor, right? Ruining people's lives for that. That was always good. So a sense of justice. But what has ended up happening is that you have a handful, maybe 5 companies that run everything. They own everything. The people that run those companies, they're not people that used to be ganja or cannabis farmers before.
True.
A lot of them are people that were involved in big business, software, banking, or they have connections to politicians. We even have a really messed up situation here, Spirit, where a lot of the former police officers have become central to a lot of these companies, right? And Jamaica, which legalized or did their reforms before St. Vincent, they've actually opened up their business for a lot of these predatory companies to come in and take advantage of, right? And
Yes.
they're using the Jamaicans as cheap labor. That's what they want them for. So it's recreating that kind of plantation system that you want to get away with,
Right.
like, right? So this is something that, you know, I think the critique coming out of St. Vincent is something that, and it's, I mean, a lot of people that are, you know, more critical would agree with you, but I think that you in St. Vincent and those that you organize with have been the most on point that I've seen when it comes to the realities that are going to happen, right? So much respect to you for that.
And I'll tell you something. What we are experiencing in St. Vincent right now, within the framework of the medical cannabis industry, there's a climate of tolerance. Whereas before that, the police used to harass the blocks. The police might have locked you up for a spliff or for an ounce of cannabis. While it's still illegal, the police doesn't terrorize the block as they used to.
That's good.
So because they don't do that, it means that it's becoming more liberal. It's leading to more freedom of cannabis. So within that climate or atmosphere, the sons of the better of classes, the more well-off classes, they will or they purchase cannabis seeds overseas, cannabis seeds with the highest THC, and they bring it back and they plant it. So you find on the blocks now, rather than, unlike before, where it was easy for a traditional cultivator to bring a pound of cannabis or 2 pounds of cannabis into the city and have it easily sold. No, it's not like that. Because consumers of cannabis, in their choice, they go for the better grade.
Right.
They go for the higher grade. So the money is now more go into the hands of the children of the well-off classes or the better off classes.
Because that's something I saw, and we can get into this a bit more, because people that aren't familiar with St. Vincent and think St. Vincent is the same as St. Lucia or Tobago or Barbados, that, you know, they think the Caribbean, everyone is growing ganja or cannabis, right? But that's not true. Cannabis plays a really important role in St. Vincent, you know, legally, but also illegally. And you said there's the climate of tolerance that is there, right? So I don't even like using the words like that, but um, it's been holding up the economy in St.
Of
Vincent for
course,
quite some time. And I know
well,
that it's something that is kind of everyone knows, but we don't really talk about it, because there's all kinds of ramifications that come from that, right? You know, but could you give people an idea? You know, I know that throughout St. Vincent people are growing, but particularly, you know, we're talking now about the eruption that happened, and that how central cannabis has been to those communities, you know, North Leeward, Fitzhugh, Chateau, like those places up there.
interesting. Yes, cannabis. You see, we recently had, in fact, the 9th of April this month, there was a eruption of the explosive eruption of the Lassover. The entire country have been suffering as a result. Banana farmers, vegetable farmers, but it has been particularly devastating for the traditional cultivators of cannabis, because most of the cannabis that are grown in St. Vincent is grown either on the slopes of the, somewhere within the vicinity of the Lassover.
Yeah.
So they have been severely affected. Today, a significant number of the evacuees, or those people have been moved from the red zone to the green zone, consist of families of traditional cultivators. And some people may say, well, sometimes I raise the issue of cannabis. I raise the issue of recovery, rebuilding, and some people think that priority shouldn't be given to traditional cultivators because cannabis is illegal. But I'll tell you something. There has been an amnesty, a medical cannabis law, and an amnesty law. So the cannabis that has been planted or was planted prior and which the eruption has destroyed has really been planted within the framework of the medical cannabis industry. The amnesty law itself allow traditional cultivators to grow their cannabis as they are growing and to sell it to a licensed purchaser. But it's a development phase that assists the transition from illicit to licit. I think St. Vincent and the Grenadines is the only country in the world that has an amnesty law. In Jamaica, for example, there's not an amnesty law. In Colombia, there's not an amnesty law. The amnesty period allows you to raise some well-needed monies. So it will facilitate your transition to the medical cannabis industry, which is indeed an expensive industry, where the input is very high financially. Outside of the amnesty, I don't think it will be so easy for traditional cultivators to get into the medical and make the contribution that will be fitting for them as traditional cultivators.
Because you raise a really important point, and I think that people tend to think that when they get this idea of a cannabis farmer, a ganja farmer, people tend to associate naively that if you're involved in the world of, like I said, I don't like to use it for ganja, but they'll say in the world of drugs.
Yes, use it. You got to use it to suit.
That somehow everyone that is involved is making a ton of money, right? They're all living like we see in the movies and on TV, that they have fancy cars, they have money to spend, and that's not the reality for the traditional cultivators in St. Vincent.
Certainly not. Not even in Colombia, not even in Mexico, not even in where they are prohibited plants like in Myanmar, where opium is, or in Thailand, where opium was. The situation always is the ordinary traditional cultivators of prohibited plants, and in our case, of cannabis, they are not drug traffickers. They are in the business because of the need to feed their families. They are in the business because there is little or no alternative. So I'll show you an example. You have cannabis, and it happens in Colombia also. It happens in Jamaica, and it is happening in St. Vincent that the purchase of cannabis will come to buy cannabis in St. Vincent. Sometimes they come without money, but they bring things like household, like television, they bring things like computers, and they bring other things to exchange for cannabis. So it shows that the embassy it needs that the traditional cultivators want. Traditional cultivators, we are broken people. Most of the time that a drug dealer or someone come to buy cannabis, they don't pay for the cannabis outright. Sometimes they give you just a small portion of the money. And then at the end of the day, you hear some nonsense story. Sometimes the money come back.
Right.
Sometimes they lost, but who lost? It's the traditional cultivator.
Because I think that's a huge thing that's going to happen now, because with the eruption, it's destroyed I would imagine it's destroyed the entire crop for most of the people that are in La Soufrière, right? That's going to have a really big impact on top of obviously the displacement and the regular disaster recovery that's going on now, because all of that money that you said, it's not a ton for each person, but collectively, it's a lot of money that would be circulating in the economy, going to come find its way back to Kingstown or to the shops for people to be able to buy things. But that money is going to be gone, right?
Yes, of course. And I'll tell you something, Kevin. We are particularly concerned about the recovery period, the period of rebuilding. What is our concern? We want to be given equal attention by the authorities. The same attention you give to the banana farmer, we want that attention. The same attention you give to the potato farmer, we want that attention. So there's that big fear among the growers that they may not be given that sort of attention, simply because cannabis has been illegal. But as I mentioned before, within the framework, with the way we are talking now, if we look at it from the perspective of the cannabis, the medical cannabis industry, the traditional cultivators were in a transitional phase from illicit to illicit. Hence the reason why we call for this equal attention.
Even before the eruption happened, I know that when St. Vincent opened up or did the reforms in late 2018, there hasn't been much time for the industry to get off the ground. And then you guys were hit with COVID almost, a year into the reforms, really. How has that also impacted, the growth of the market? Because I know that you have been someone to set up a network of cooperatives, and that
Yes.
the idea was to partner, because you mentioned, right, there needs, it's not, if you're going to grow for a medicinal market, you can't just grow in the bush. You need to be
Right.
able to have land, which is the biggest thing, access to land, but it needs to be secured. There needs to be specific growing techniques that meet the standards for it to be a medicinal ingredient. So there's a lot of money that needs to come in, and not necessarily the traditional cultivators on their own have that. So this is where there's a need to sometimes partner with foreign investors. But the idea is that the benefit will ultimately bring up the traditional farmers as well.
Yes.
Because
you
of,
see, Kevin, if you're going to build a medical cannabis industry, I tell you up front, it can't be done in isolation. It can't be done by the traditional cultivators on their own. The demand for the cannabis is global. The demand is in the bigger countries, and which need certain medicine, and the traditional cultivators, we have the traditional knowledge, which is very critical and important. We know the environment here. But what we are seeking to do is to merge that scientific know-how that comes from out there with the traditional know-how that we have. And interestingly, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, traditional cultivators have been given 2 years without having to pay a license. Other than the amnesty, which helps to facilitate their transition to the medical industry, you have been given 2 years within the framework of the medical industry, where you are not pressured or the law doesn't compel you to pay a license. So it helps us to prepare ourselves to play a more significant role in the industry itself. And then traditional cultivators, each cultivator is allowed to about 5 acres of land. You can farm without paying any license for 2 years. So it gives us certain concession that is not, we don't see present in other countries. And I think that is one of the things, those are some of the reasons why that explain the processing system has been different. And that has happened thanks to the struggle of the CRC, thanks to the pressure exerted by the traditional cultivators, and thanks also to the goodwill of the government.
But something that like I said, going back to the beginning, is you are someone that has been involved in organizing with the cannabis farmers for many years. So like I was surprised when I was in St. Lucia and I was talking to some of the cannabis farmers that they were there. They were kind of all for legalization. And so I thought a similar thing would happen in St. Vincent when I arrived there to talk. Spirit, the angle of the computer, if you could drop it down a bit, because we were only seeing the hat. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
That's
So
good.
yeah, and when I was there, and I know you had connected me to some people, you introduced me to a lot of farmers, and I had met, you know, a bunch on my own too, but I noticed that like the level of consciousness or the political perspective of the farmers was much different. I'm not saying there isn't anyone in St. Lucia that was like that. There's some very conscious folks that are there, but almost everyone I spoke to when I was up in the hills, or even if I was in, you know, by the market in Kingstown and talking to somebody about what they were doing on the side for their hustle, they were very clear. They understood the politics of legalization being potentially very dangerous. And I think that a large part of that is because you've blended that work about, you know, ganja or cannabis as a part of liberation, connecting it to a way to have some self-determination for St. Vincent as a country and for people of African descent to have control over what you produce and how you do it. But the other thing that comes to mind is that issue is why so many people were having to farm on the slopes of La Soufrière. So I know obviously some people live there. A lot of people live in the northern part of the island, but because a lot of it's because people don't have access to land, right?
That
And
is true.
that's not just an issue that's on this government alone, but it goes back to the colonial era,
That is
how
true.
people have been pushed away, and you still have some people. I don't have the exact statistic because these things don't happen that often, but it was saying that the concentration of land in St. Vincent, that you have it that there was about 20 odd people controlled almost 60% of the best land in St. Vincent. Not all of the land, but the best land, because there's a lot of crown land too where people have to go and grow. So I was just wondering if you see, because of the eruption that happened, and maybe it will take some time for people to go back to these communities, do you see an option opening up for people to access land in the green zone or the yellow zone?
You know what I see the potential possibility of. Yeah, where people have been moved from the red zone to the green zone. I see opportunity to build in partnership between local landowners and traditional cultivators. I'll tell you something. To get into quite a number of local landowners who will like to get into the medical cannabis industry, but it's expensive. But for traditional cultivators, it's relatively easy. As I mentioned, you have 2 years without being a license. You have an amnesty. So what we are doing at this very moment is engaging in discussion some of our local landowners who wants to get into the industry, but doesn't have the necessary finance to partner with the traditional cultivators, who are allowed certain concessions, and let us build the industry. And this will allow us to give a more reflection of our Vincentian industry, own an industry that the local people have a significant position in it. So right now discussions are because in the shelters where traditional cultivators are, almost every day a girl is coming and asks me, how can he get some lands to farm? Because he can't go back in his area, not in the very near future, to grow cannabis, and he wants to continue to grow cannabis. So it's a very important question, and we are looking at it, and we are looking at building partnership with our local landowners in order to develop this industry. I'll tell you something. You mentioned St. Lucia just now, but in the Caribbean, there are 2 producers of cannabis relative to countries. That is Jamaicans and Vincent. We are producing countries. St. Lucia is a consuming country. Barbados is consuming. Antigua is consuming. So the idea of legalization can be easily sold there. It's more readily accepted than in St. Vincent. There are persons here who push that, the Rastafarians push the legalization aspect of it. And that's because they have their religious sacrament. We support them in their legalization. In fact, we support legalization because we want cannabis to be ultimately legalized. But we have to be very strategic. We have to be very careful how we do it. We have to be careful how we navigate it. We can't do it at the expense of our grass.
No, I think that's great, and I realize the time. So what I wanted to do.
You talk. I have time.
Okay, no, that's great. So I wanted to ask, in terms of, I know you've been organizing a campaign to raise awareness about the situation that traditional farmers have been in, and you've given us sort of an idea of the obstacles they face as not being able to go back to where they used to farm, and their crops are gone, and all of these issues that are there. You had passed along some statements that you were involved in putting out to the broader international community, or people that are following the issue of cannabis reform in the Caribbean, but globally as well. Did you want to speak to a bit of what is in that letter, and also the angle again? It's creeping up.
Yes. Well, in light of what happened with the volcano eruption, we have put out an appeal, international appeal, calling for support for the traditional cultivators, particularly in their recovery, in the recovery aspect of their life. We have been assisted by an organization called Transnational Institute, TNI, And TNI is an organization with lots of years of experience. They have been working in the area of democracy and drugs in Asia, in Latin America, in the Caribbean. They are based in Europe. They help to facilitate conversation between policymakers and civil society representatives or traditional cultivators. They were instrumental in, I remember the first global forum of producers of prohibited plants that was held in Barcelona, Spain, attended by over 60 representatives from all parts of the globe, including Colombia, Mexico, Myanmar, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. They look at issues like opium, coca, and cannabis, basically those three. And they have assisted, with the changes at the level of the United Nations. There once upon a time, civil society representative on the issue of drugs didn't have the opportunity to present the traditional cultivators' views, the conditions that cause them to get involved in cannabis. These forums that was organized gave us the opportunity to do that, or did give us the opportunity to do that. So we used those forums to solicit the views of traditional cultivators in different parts of the globe to take it at the level of UNGAS. You know what I mean by UNGAS?
Yeah, the United Nations.
United Right.
Yeah.
And so our voices could be heard there. Today, there have been significant changes at that level. Whereas before, you had the pro-illegal people, like led by the United States, of course, been hard on drugs. Today, the balance of forces within the United Nations is increasingly changing in favor of legalization, in favor of the plight of the traditional cultivators. Listen to the cultivators. Hear their story. We are not big drug dealers. We are not the Escobars. We are not those who use cannabis in order to make billions of dollars and pocket it. Our engagement in cannabis is done primarily in order to feed our families, in order to take care of our families. And it's from that perspective that the CRC is approaching the cannabis system. I'll tell you something. When we look at the history of cannabis reform, you notice that concession historically has been given to consumers. You look in Amsterdam. Yeah, you're allowed to, I think Amsterdam is one of the countries you can speak about who has led the way in terms of decriminalization. Even in Canada, even in the States, in Portugal, in many countries, you hear they talk about legalization allowed to one slip or legalization for some religious reasons. You scarcely hear about legalization to great.
Right.
So we are giving priority. We are emphasizing that aspect of our struggle. We want the traditional cultivators, they who have been the foundation of this movement, they who have been at the bottom, without whom you're not able to recreate. We want the emphasis to be placed there.
So something I wanted to ask, because I think you mentioning the point that there's really only two producing countries, and then I'm just imagining the people in St. Lucia. They say, "Oh man, we're growing our own stuff or whatever." But I think until you go to St. Vincent and you see the level or the scale of cultivation, that there's nothing like that exists
Right.
anywhere else. Even
And
even
Kevin,
in yeah
you mentioned Lucia. It is true that Lucia is increasingly becoming more, they're getting more and more into production, but it has reached a stage of being the dominant
yeah
aspect of the business.
no and
St.
that's
Vincent,
something that I think is really important to get across, because people think that if there was to be legalization, that Barbados would be able to supply all of its demand, that the same thing would be with St. Lucia or Dominica or to Trinidad and Tobago, where you can see this with a lot of other agricultural products, right? Because if there is legalization, that means that cannabis would become like bananas or that. But yet we still have a situation where the Caribbean, as crazy as it is, sometimes you're getting your pineapples, they're grown in Ecuador. The bananas are grown in Colombia. They come off the ship in Miami. Do you see with the United States, with the change of administration that Biden is there now, and Canada's been doing its thing on legalization, that CARICOM has really kind of missed an opportunity in terms of trying to build a regional market? Because the reality is like with everything, when the states gets a piece of it, they'll want as much of it as they can get, and
yes,
that
yes,
that might end up undermining Caribbean farmers
yes,
because you're
yes,
doing
but
it individually, right? In
yes,
terms of St. Vincent has had to, Jamaica goes, then St. Vincent goes,
yes,
and other islands haven't yet. If you could speak to that idea about like a regional,
yeah, because I think it was last year we had a we have a group called Caribbean Patriot Group, and we look basically at cannabis. Make up a representative from St. Lucia, Jamaica, St. Vincent, Barbados, and we held a workshop, and it was organized large. Well, we got the support from TNI. They helped to finance it. We had a workshop in St. Vincent sometime last year. The MCA was also involved. And following that workshop, we established a regional group and we did a position paper. And that position paper was sent to the heads of government within the CARICOM. And it's exactly the same what you're talking about here, where we call for a coordinated approach relative to medical cannabis so that we can control the cannabis industry from a regional perspective rather than allowing the Americans or the Europeans to come in and monopolize it.
because
Exactly. And I'll make available to you. I think I did send it to you.
yeah,
A position paper where we are calling for the heads of government to discuss it in conjunction with civil society representatives, in conjunction with traditional cultivators, so we could come up with the best possible option so that the what comes out of the medical cannabis industry is largely benefited by the people in the region and the respective countries. So
do,
we see it as now it has reached that stage. We think there's still time for us to see what we can do to ensure that it is done in the best interest of our people. But I think if it's legalized by the Americans and by everyone, we will have some problems.
Because something that a lot of people, when they talk about going back to this idea how people can be naive about legalization, and that they think it's like a golden ticket to solve everyone's going to get rich off of cannabis or do really well off of it. And a lot of people are thinking that the export market would be like unlimited, that you'll be able to, as much as you grow, you'll be able to sell. But we also know that countries are greedy. They like to protect their own markets. Like the US pays their farmers to grow rice and sell it to put farmers out of business in Haiti and things like that. Would you, as a grower and a representative of the growers, if there was to only be the regional market, do you think that that would be good enough for the region to begin with or to start with?
To begin with, it's important that we take that step to begin with it. But I think we have to go outside the framework of the region. I'll tell you, the prospect of doing that, we think is good in a way. Because I'll tell you something, we have, look at our climate, look at our environment. We have 20, we don't have snow here. Our soil is an advantage. So I think those things are plus relative to the end product, to the kind of cannabis that you get at the end of the day. Because we have seen investors who have been growing cannabis in Canada, leaving Canada and coming to St. Vincent, coming to Jamaica, because our soil, our climate is an added advantage. And we think it will always be an added advantage.
Because that idea of the regional market, and I maybe I said it kind of the wrong way in terms of it, if you could only have that, but I think that it's important to establish that as the minimum in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And that's something that I don't think is being discussed enough.
That
if the whole region was to say, we will supply our own medicinal cannabis, we won't import it unless some people want to, but we can provide what we need, right? And you said to extend that window of tolerance throughout the region, because I think this is something like people might often overlook, and I know you're very familiar because you've been doing this so long and have been so involved in the process in St. Vincent, is how policy is really important. That a lot of people will think it has to be legalization, but kind of mixing the policies so that you have space to breathe.
Right. And I look at the tourism market. For example, I can say now, you may have someone leaving a state in federally, cannabis is not legal in America. And a tourist might want to leave a state to go on a tour. He knows if he comes to the Caribbean, in fact, he may have a medical problem and he may require medical cannabis. But in order to get that, he has to go to a country where medical cannabis is legal. So by looking at that, is in this way, we think that we as Caribbean people could capitalize on such opportunity and do well in the cannabis industry. It has to be tied to drug tourism.
And I think that's something that, looking at cannabis as agricultural commodity, like I said, bananas or coconuts or things like that, and I think it's an important opportunity because for a lot of people, yes, cannabis has been grown in the hills for as long as people can remember, but in terms of it being legalized or having reforms where it's decriminalized or allowed for medicinal use, that is new. So that's exciting for a lot of people. And I think if the region or St. Vincent in particular can get the ganja or cannabis industry connected, like you said, to tourism, but to also processing and refining, to have that done locally so
Right.
that that money is circulated,
Manufacturing.
that can set the example for other things. So like if you had coconuts, you could have the copra, you could have the coconut oil, you can have the coconut water, you can make sure that you have all these other industries that spring out of the one. And I think that this is why ganja and cannabis is so important, because people are looking to see what can be done, because people have given up a lot in terms of coconuts. Even though there's a shortage of coconuts globally, we don't have people rushing to do that, but people will say we need to get into the cannabis business. I realize the money involved is a bit different, um and the export opportunities are a bit different, but I think that, you know, as you mentioned, it's part of that liberation, and you are thinking of the long picture. You're not just necessarily thinking about what might make the most money for some people very quickly. You're thinking about the longer term, which is unique, because a lot of the politicians, I think, not speaking in St. Vincent in particular, but around the Caribbean, they're looking for that quick buck to do it, and not necessarily take the correct or well thought out position like you have.
And we have been appealing to our growers here to be part of the industry. Increasingly, growers have been coming on board. There's still lots of growers who's not on board yet. I suspect that with the fallout caused by the eruption, it will encourage more of them to come on board. Uh, well, people wouldn't come on board overnight. But the thing is that the way how the region is developing, the way how the cannabis industry is attracting people in the region and different countries. For example, Barbados, Antigua, St. Lucia, they have passed laws. Where they have passed laws, it simply means that since they now and they were previously some of the markets that St. Vincent traditional cultivators used to target. But with the relaxation of the laws in those countries, naturally we're going to lose some of those markets. The illegal aspect of cannabis will be dwindling. It will be putting less monies into the hands of traditional cultivators. And for this reason, they have to join the march sooner or later, or they'll just move out of the business.
Right. No, I think that's probably not the most positive note to end on, but it's a transition into, you know, trying
Right.
to get people
And next
onto
thing,
better.
Kevin, people tired, lost, and their loved ones.
Yeah.
You take it easy, growing your cannabis in St. Vincent, jumping on a speedboat, taking it to Barbados. You have been intercepted by the illegal people like the Coast Guard, or you've been intercepted by a group of pirates who take your produce, sometimes kill everyone on board. You think it's easy. And we have had a lot of experiences in this. People tired. People tired growing their cannabis and having it stolen, having it eradicated after investing thousands of dollars into it. We need something more sustainable. And if medical cannabis or legalized cannabis brings some sustainability, then the CRC and it's going to lead our traditional cultivators into that realm of the industry.
Okay, I think that's a great spot to end on, Spirit. So I just wanted to thank you, comrade, for taking the time to talk to me. It's good to see you. I know that you're busy with everything that's happening, so I really appreciate you stopping everything that you were doing to talk to me
Right.
for this time.
And I want to finally use this opportunity
Yeah.
to use this very medium, use this very avenue.
And hopefully we can do this
appeal.
more, and we can check in more as things
Right. I
progress.
hope that.
And
I mean, from time to time, you can reach out to me. You can reach out to me. I tell you something before I end. Is that I remember I told you I was in prison for 11 and a half years. Remember I told you I used to use cannabis in order, it wasn't the party's decision, but I used cannabis in order to support the movement.
right.
I spent 11 and a half years in prison, and this had led to a level of marginalization because after a time my main associates became lawbreakers. Those are the persons who I more befriend. After you spend 11 and a half years in jail, sleep in the same room, line up in the same line, eating the same food, the people who break the law, you build up a level of relationship with them. So you come out, you want to walk along with them to help to change their ways. Many of them are people who engage in cannabis. And politically, any political struggle, after you face this level of marginalization, I began focusing on cannabis. And I'm trying to use cannabis as an opportunity, as an avenue to make my stamp, to put a stamp on the process. And in order to bequeath some kind of rich legacy for the youth of this country and for my own family. You know, I think too often because of my engagement in cannabis, I'm seen more as a lawbreaker, as a drug dealer, rather than a champion of the cause of the oppressed traditional cultivators. I'm going to use cannabis as the opportunity to ride out of that, to make my voice, to ride out of that, to make my voice be heard. Thank you, Calvin. Thank you.
No problem, Spirit. Anytime. And like I said, there's so much.